All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm Glenn Ruga, the founder and director of the Social Documentary Network. I'm here with Barbara Ayotte, the communications director, and I'm here with three of the photographers and one of the writers from this issue of ZEKE magazine, who I'll introduce in a second. It's always so great to see so many faces, both from around the US and around the world, at these documentary matters. This is the first of two panels with photographers and writers from the Incarceration issue of ZEKE magazine. And we have here with us today Christopher Blackwell, who's the guest editor of the Incarceration issue, and three of the photographers, Brian Frank, Sara Bennett, and Lou Jones. Christopher is calling in from the Washington Correction Center in Shelton, Washington, and the technology of this is a little complicated, so just bear with us when Chris comes in. And he's limited to 20 minutes speaking at a time, so hopefully we time this right and I won't cut him off, but just so you know. The Incarceration issue of ZEKE was conceived to shine light on a very important but not well understood issue in the United States, a country with the highest incarceration rate in the world. Nearly 2 million people live behind bars, a situation that many people on the outside know little about. Regardless of their guilt or innocence, the basic human and civil rights of detainees must be respected and are often denied. Many are incarcerated because of direct racist policies of the United States or because of a history of the US deliberately maintaining an underclass that is subject to all the indignities of poverty, lack of education, and broken families. In a few moments, Christopher Blackwell and the three photographers will talk to us more about this. This issue of ZEKE magazine is available digitally on the ZekeMagazine.com website, and you can also purchase an individual copy of the print issue or a subscription at the ZEKE website. And this is an advanced copy of ZEKE. The remaining are in transit from our printer in Lithuania right at the moment. It should be arriving in the United States actually tomorrow. And I hope you can consider subscribing to ZEKE, the print issue, or purchasing an individual copy, which you can do at ZekeMagazine.com. On November 6th, we'll be having part 2 of Photographing Incarceration with 4 other photographers and a writer from the Incarceration issue. And this will be an afternoon panel starting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. And information is on the SDN website. I hope you can join us for that panel as well. A few things before we get started. This event is being recorded and in a few days will be posted to the SDN YouTube channel, which you can find on the homepage of the SDN website. And the chat is open, and we encourage people to say hi and let us know where you're Zooming from. Each speaker will present their work for approximately 15 minutes, and then we'll take 1 or 2 questions after each presentation, and then open up for a more general Q&A when all the presenters are completed. And if you want to ask a question, the preferred thing is just to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question. But if that's awkward, or you can also use the Zoom raise your hand function, or ask your question in chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat. So our first speaker is Christopher Blackwell, who's calling in from the Washington Correction Center in Shelton, Washington. I hope he's here with us now. Let's see, Debbie, is Chris on the call now?
Yep, yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great. All right. So you can hear me and we can hear you. Chris is the guest editor for the Incarceration issue of ZEKE magazine and an award-winning journalist. He's serving a 45-year prison sentence for taking another human's life during a drug robbery, something he takes full accountability for. He was raised in a mixed Native American white family in the Hilltop area of Tacoma, Washington, one of the roughest places to live in the country, ravaged by over-policing, gangs, violence, and drugs. He's the co-founder of Look to Justice, a grassroots organization led by criminal legal system impacted people that works to transform the legal system by providing civic education and empowerment programs for incarcerated people and their loved ones. His writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Boston Globe, Huffington Post, Marshall Project, Insider, Jewish Currents, BuzzFeed, The Appeal, and many others. And he's currently in the process of working on a book about solitary confinement. All right, now let me turn this over to Chris.
All right, thank you, Glenn. Well, hello, everybody. It's great to be in a space here with you today. You know, and I want to take a little bit of time and share like some of my history, my background, and some of the things that I see and have experienced through the carceral system, and also some of the ways I think that we can begin to transition out so we become less reliant on things like prisons and policing and things like that, so we can move to more safer communities. So for as long as I can remember, communities like mine have been breeding grounds for the development of lifelong traumas, violence, and constant oppression. By the age of 12, I was on my way to the juvenile system to serve a year of incarceration for joyriding in a stolen car. Obviously something I shouldn't have done, but obviously the answer wasn't to send me there for a year at such a young age. You know, this was common in my neighborhood when I grew up. It was like a rite of passage, right, to enter the system and be a part of the carceral system. Everybody I knew had been a part of it, and all the adults were off in prison most of the time. What I experienced while inside wasn't geared towards rehabilitation, positive reform, but instead I was exposed to more violence, a severe lack of educational opportunities, and a need to learn to protect myself at any cost, often through violence. I learned to act first or become a victim. When released, I was far off worse than I had been when I went in. And having this happen at such a young age often retrains our minds on how to best survive opposed to thrive, allowing me to remain in this toxic cycle through misguided principles. Because of this, I continued to live a life of crime. Unable to catch up in school due to the back and forth stints in the juvenile system, my role models quickly became neighborhood drug dealers, not the teachers who were trying to help me in school. Eventually, I landed in the adult sentence system with a 45-year prison sentence for taking another human's life. Growing up, it seemed inevitable that my life would end anywhere else besides prison or dead. All I had ever learned was to protect myself through violence. I never learned how to be accountable or how to work to reduce harm, only how to survive in a broken community. After a decade in the adult system, countless hours spent in reconstructing the way I was taught to think and survive, I learned about true accountability, which I believe this is the key to us changing individuals as they enter the system. I learned accountability comes in stages. The first step is recognizing the harm you've caused others. Second is to give back and begin to reduce the harm you've caused society. And third is to fully understand a way to show others how to not cause that harm. I learned changing my life wasn't enough. I needed to apply what I had learned to help others in doing so, becoming what I call a transformer. And most important, I learned accountability is not synonymous with life and long sentences. Those of us just serving arbitrary numbers of years in prison doesn't do anything to keep our community safer. And that's how we ended up today with mass incarceration and where we are. During my incarceration, I've co-founded mentor programs, been a part of all kinds of writing projects, started Look to Justice, been a facilitator and trained restorative practices, and done things that actually went far beyond the walls from where I reside. And I'm not the only one. Just like back in my community when I wasn't the only one to go to serve in the carceral system, I'm not the only one who sits behind these walls and works to help heal our communities and heal the men who are going to re-enter inside of them. But the problem is there isn't enough of the people outside that are doing this work, the transformers, as I call them. And we need more. Our communities need more. This is our path in reducing and eventually ending the cycle of trauma and violence that's plagued our communities for a lifetime. We can no longer ignore the devastating harm communities like mine have been forced to suffer through and continue to experience today. We must heal harms for all involved. That means for the victims who often experience the harm that we cause, but also for many of us who were victimized throughout our entire childhoods, so that we can begin to heal ourselves, because then we won't be in a place to hurt people. We won't be in a place to survive and living in that situation. Hurt people, and we know that. So that's the cycle that we have to break. By interrupting cycles of violence from continuing, we can get to a better society, and we can become less reliant on things like mass incarceration. We achieve this by involving previously impacted people who were previously impacted by the system, because those are the people who know best how to help our communities and how to get us to safer environments, by also showing the ones who are still suffering from a lifestyle of trauma and violence how to escape that and get more into a healing and safer place to be. Remembering that we are all redeemable, that we can all participate in society in a healing way, humanizing the people who are behind prison walls, behind fences, behind the razor wire. Like, that should be our goal, is that we humanize individuals and bring them back and not ostracize them. The purpose of our justice system shouldn't be to oppress, abuse, and harm those who have spent a lifetime receiving such treatment. Our justice system should be constructed to rebuild, rehabilitate, and reform. The time of simply warehousing humans must end. We cannot continue to just hold people for arbitrary numbers of years without understanding the mitigating factors and the circumstances that they've continued to experience throughout most of their lives. It's time for us to heal people. It's time for us to rebuild our communities. And to do that, we must rebuild the people that enter inside these prisons. I hope all of you take the time to support our project. I'm very excited about the project we were able to put together with ZEKE Magazine, and myself and many of the photographers and countless people on the inside. And I'm just really hoping that all of you can read with an open mind, that you can share to people who might not necessarily be the choir, and that we can start to show people a different side of what we're dealing with and how we get to a safer society. Thank you.
Chris, thank you. That was really a very powerful discussion that we all need to hear, and it's a great introduction into the photos. We can take one or two questions for Chris right now. Does anybody from the audience want to ask a question? I would encourage you just to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. But if you want to raise your hand or put it in the chat. I see a hand raised. Ali MC. Unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Ali. I'm just zooming in from NAM, otherwise known as Melbourne, Australia. Chris, I just had a quick question. You mentioned in the bio that you were raised in part on a Native American background. In Australia, Indigenous people are the most incarcerated people here. Extraordinary amounts of Aboriginal people are part of the carceral system here, way out of proportion. And I was curious to know whether, in your experience and thoughts, whether colonization had impacted Native American people and the incarceration system as it has done here in so-called Australia.
Right. So yeah, thank you for that question. That's an important question. So absolutely, right. Colonization always impacts the people who were there before that colonization took part. And absolutely, the numbers and the percentage of Native Americans and Indigenous people in Washington state, where I'm at, are by far the most highly incarcerated as juveniles and in general in the system per 100,000 residents. So yeah, that's dead on. And we experience that because of the trauma and stuff that is left behind on reservations and in these areas where Indigenous people reside.
Would anybody else like to ask a question before we move on? All right, thank you, Chris. Chris will be hanging up momentarily because he's only allowed a 20-minute phone call at a time, but he'll call in later for the larger Q&A. So our next speaker is Brian Frank, a San Francisco native.
The caller has hung up.
A San Francisco native, Brian Frank has created social documentary projects across the Americas, focusing on cultural identity, social inequality, violence, workers' rights, and the environment. A professor of journalism and a Catchlight Global Fellow, Frank has led visual storytelling workshops for professional educators and journalists across the United States and children and teens in the US and Mexico, and has lectured on visuals-based curriculum at universities nationwide. His work has been recognized with numerous awards and featured in many publications. Okay, Brian, go ahead and unmute yourself.
There you go. Thank you for that intro, Glenn. Should I go ahead and start maybe sharing my screen so we can look at some pictures?
Sure.
Great. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, we're seeing the thumbnails now.
All right, sounds good. So I'm going to go ahead and share some images that are going to be in this upcoming issue of the magazine. The work is actually, sorry, let me fix that. Don't want it to scroll without me. This set of images is from a series I call What My Daughter Learned of the Sea. And it's actually, these are images from Las Calinas jail in San Diego County, which is the women's jail there. I was invited to photograph there a few years back. I was invited to come there with Carrie Blakinger, who's a criminal justice reporter, previously incarcerated journalist. And it was all part of an issue of Washington Post magazine. The reason we were invited there was because everyone who was contributing to that initial issue was somebody who had served time. I personally worked on criminal justice for years, having very, specific interest in it because of my experience as a juvenile and as a young adult, being impacted by the criminal justice system, having been in and out of juvenile hall, and also into my early 20s, having dealt with racist policing, being singled out and incarcerated multiple times. And that affected my worldview on many levels and affected my journalism that I practice to this day. So, that's kind of a little bit about me and why these things matter to me. So the reason I was invited to Las Calinas in particular was because, it's very difficult to get access to any prison as a photographer, any jail as a photographer. But Las Calinas is a place that the County of San Diego is very proud of because they feel that it is an example of what gender-specific incarceration can be and should be. Women face very specific issues when they are incarcerated, and the criminal justice system in general was catered towards men. So women, end up entering into this system that doesn't address specific needs that women have. Women are much more likely to have been victims of violent crime and have extreme trauma in their, and psychological damage from that trauma if they are incarcerated, and they have a slew of other needs, such as being pregnant when they're incarcerated, being much more likely to be single mothers, etc. So these at Las Calinas, though, they tried to address this through their honors program. These women are in honors programming, which is that, as for now, a small percentage of these women are allowed much more freedom and much more programming than would traditionally be allowed in any prison or jail. These women are in the laundry room. These are all women who have kind of earned special privileges, and they're here watching Downton Abbey here. So, when I was photographing this, obviously, the prison administrators really wanted us to focus on the honor program. And so, the first set of images, a lot of the initial images from my initial visit are from things like this, like the laundry room where women are singing and doing laundry and enjoying additional freedoms. And this is women that were able to work in the cafeteria and again, have access to better food. But while we were kind of working on this, I think that what I know me and Carrie, as we were chatting, started to realize was like, this, even though it was true that there was this like much more progressive, positive form of incarceration going on, where women were being given access to education, therapy, yoga, job training, etc. There also was just a large percentage, the majority actually, of the women who were just still locked up in a traditional prison environment. So, after kind of trying to build as many relationships there on site as I could, and I eventually was kind of able to massage my way into away from these initial images, which are from the honors program, and actually begin to start photographing in the more traditional, sterile warehousing environment that the majority of the women at the jail existed in. So this is where we started to get into that environment, and this is in just the exercise yard here. Now, I think like something I try to do with all of my images is like, I think that my biggest fear would be to reinforce stereotypes that the public has of incarcerated people. And so I'm always looking for images that just kind of are common human images of moments that we all share together. I don't think that we need to be looking for images that are reinforcing like this tough criminal look that we see way too much in often racist media portrayals of people that are incarcerated. So I'm mostly trying to find, soft moments with folks. But and also real moments, things that I remember from the times that I was incarcerated. Some of those scary, like the moments that always stuck with me, were times that I had to call home, and so I always like kind of have a personal relationship with that phone because it's the one lifeline to the outside world, and it's always something that was very emotional when I had to call my mom, for instance. All of these ladies are actually on their brief period outdoors that they got some exercise time. So this is on the kind of exercise yard and just getting a bit of sunlight. You don't really appreciate how the sun can make you feel until you're deprived of it. And so I think that I wanted to photograph out on that yard just to like in these moments when people were allowed to kind of feel human. So that's the series of images that I wanted to share with you guys. And I am happy to take any questions about the work or any other criminal justice work for that matter.
Any questions for Brian? Michelle, I see your hands up. Unmute yourself, Michelle.
Brian, it's nice to meet you and everybody else.
Nice to meet you.
I was in Las Calinas for about 7 years, and what I found really upsetting was the old Las Calinas, which was across the street. The women had no opportunities for any of this and of anything positive. They basically were not offered anything. And I was involved with the honor prisoners also in that Future Achievers and Reentry and the Reentry program. So it's nice to see that the new Las Calinas, at least they're doing something positive for these women, because I used to find it so upsetting to see women just sitting around, and they would sort of, that just creates more depression and more stewing and more uneasiness, I guess. But
yes.
So
I think well, the old Las Colinas was pretty notorious. And yeah, I mean, I think that there was a big investment put into this new Las Colinas. Now, I think one of the big problems, though, is just that even though there is, again, it's like I almost think that the honors programming is disproportionately represented in the media because, you know, 85% of the women, even in the new Las Colinas, are still living under similar conditions to what you would have experienced in the old Las Colinas. But obviously, there's a push to allow media into the honors programming, right? You know, and so, you know, but one thing I will say that was positive was that, you know, the administrators actually, I think, are trying to get more women into honors programming there. And I think they almost were allowing me to see the bad parts of the jail with the hope that I would be like, hey, like, this isn't right. Like, let's get more women into the good parts of the jail. It's super expensive. They have like trouble getting the funding to expand honors programming is what it comes down to. It's more expensive per inmate. And, you know, so I think until they address, you know, that, and like one of those shames is that women are put into more restrictive housing based on rules that were established for men. Women that aren't necessarily dangerous, you know, they are considered dangerous because of rules that would normally apply to men. And so, you know, based on the types of infractions, et cetera, but I don't think that it necessarily crosses over like the types of like rules infractions that women more commonly have will lead them to being not allowed into honors housing, but it doesn't mean that they're physically violent necessarily, for example. So anyways, I think until like these things are addressed, the funding and the reclassification and like an addressing of the fact that women should be that their classification where they are placed in a prison is different than men. I think that until they address those things, like, you know, you'll just continue to have most of the women, unfortunately, in very restrictive housing versus in the honors programming.
Well, I agree with you. And I was a big advocate for how these women were treated, even in the new program. And there was still, you know, it looks like it's all fun and games, or, you know, they have a lot of freedom, and they really don't. And I think a lot of it has to do with the whole mentality and dynamics actually between the deputies and how they actually look at these women. And there's such a discourse between treating them as women, as people, and as something lesser than. They even treated me that way sometimes. So anyway, I'm a big advocate, and I just found I wanted to say hello because I spent a lot of time there also. I actually, when they were moved into the new Las Colinas, we were in there about 6 months, and they had a security breach. So somebody, and I was asked not to come back, and then the pandemic came, and I haven't really been back. But I have friends who were in there, and they are trying to help these women. And I agree with you. There were so many women I met who were wonderful women and really didn't deserve to be incarcerated. At least that's how I felt. They needed to be in treatment programs. And the loss of children and what that did to their families was heartbreaking.
Yes, and I think, you know, like you said, I mean, I think the impact on families is different when we incarcerate women, right? I mean, like, and if you don't address that, you just have these huge repercussions in society. And like, I mean, that's one of the things that makes this story, I think, important, because even at Las Colinas, I mean, that is something that,
and that's, I mean, like a model place, right? That's where you want.
Right, that's a model place, but women are still, you know, they are separated from their children, their babies, from, you know, like there's huge generational impact from that I think is different than when you separate a father.
Brian, let's move on to one more question before we move on. Deirdre Bannon has had her hand raised patiently. Deirdre, why don't you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi there. Thank you so much. Brian, thanks for your work and for sharing it with us tonight. It's really moving. I'm a journalist, but more on the writing side. I am a reporter and editor, but I'm trying to improve my visual journalism skills. So that said, I was really curious about the title of your project, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and help explain why you named it that.
Yeah. Well, there's an image in in the piece where one of the women is reading a book called Waltzing the Cat. And I kind of like, it's a silent, sorry?
I remember seeing that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like a quiet moment. I ended up like kind of looking at what that book was about and thinking about and then like thinking about what it means and how it's this idea of like making order out of chaos, a little bit, was kind of the idea. And then I ended up like just writing some poetry about that and about what about it. It led me to like what mothers know and like teach their children basically, and like how they help them make order out of life. And I ended up writing, like having this picture in my head of walking barefoot among seashells and a mother teaching. I have it written right here. Each step felt like a small victory, as if I were conquering some unseen obstacle with every footfall. I kind of got to that point. And so like, I think for me, like the title of about like, it has to do with what mothers don't get to leave their children when they are incarcerated, like how they don't get to share these things of like how to navigate through the sharp shells on the sand, was like kind of what I was imagining when I wrote the title.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Let's move on to our next presenter, Sara Bennett. After 18 years as a public defender, Sara Bennett turned her attention to photographing women with life sentences inside and outside prison. Her work has been widely exhibited in solo shows, including the Blue Sky Gallery in Portland, Oregon, and in group shows, including the Blanton Museum of Art's Day Jobs, and featured in publications such as the New York Times, Variety, and Rolling Stone's American Injustice, and others. Okay, Sara.
You can hear me, right?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to share my screen and let's see. Do you see it? Not yet. You see it now, right?
Yeah, and we're seeing a thumbnail.
Okay. Yeah, you're seeing it full screen, right?
Yeah.
So this is one of the images from ZEKE magazine for my bedroom project, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and how I got to photographing women with life sentences. So as Glenn said, I used to be a criminal defense attorney for 18 years, and I left the practice in 2004. And actually, I had a different career after that as an anti-homework advocate, and I wrote a book called The Case Against Homework. Somewhere around 2009, some of the formerly incarcerated women I knew came to me and asked me whether I would take on the case of a woman named Judith Clark, who was serving a 75-year to life sentence in New York State Prison. And her only hope of getting out of prison was if the governor would grant her clemency, which is a really extraordinary remedy. Governors were barely giving clemency back then. I think they came to me because I had won clemency for one of my clients in the early 2000s. So I had been working on her case for a couple of years, and I was always walking around the streets trying to figure out how I could make her feel more human to the governor, because in the prison, she kind of had a reputation. She was somebody who had founded a lot of programs and people really liked her. And she was one of the longest serving prisoners at that point. And I was building a big political campaign basically for her. And I gave a talk probably somewhere around 2011. And there were maybe a couple hundred people in the audience, and somebody came running up out of the audience and said, if it weren't for Judy, I wouldn't have a relationship with my children. And then somebody else came running up and said, if it weren't for Judy, I never would have gotten my degree while I was in prison. And so I was like, and you would have thought I staged it, but I hadn't. And I was trying to figure out how I could harness that and make her jump off the paper. And then, I don't know, one day it popped into my head that I would photograph some of the women who had been incarcerated with Judy have them write about her influence on them. And I would put together a little booklet. And I was not a photographer. My husband's a photographer. I had actually not picked up a camera in probably 30 years. But these are the photos you see. These are some of the women who were incarcerated with Judy. And I put together a booklet. It's like 15 pages. It's called Spirit on the Inside. And I sent it to, at that point, there was a newly created commission on reentry in New York State. And I sent it to 50 people, and I heard back from 11 of them, which was kind of, I wasn't expecting it at all. And they were like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then I showed it to some of my friends, and they were really, really curious about the women I had photographed. Not so much Judy, but, oh, she had a kid. Oh, she was in prison. What was she in prison for? And I realized I should have known this, but I realized that people didn't think about people in prison. And if they did, they had a really, really big stereotype. And so I thought, I'm going to try to figure out how to counter that. So what I did was I told Judy that I wanted to photograph women in their reentry, and she introduced me to a woman named Kayla, who I'm not showing here because Tracy was the second person that I started photographing. And Tracy happens to be in this issue of ZEKE magazine. But I started following 4 women in their reentry. And I was always interviewing them about, you know, what it was like. And I was just trying to show all the things that are the matter with the system, but sort of through the women on the outside rather than the women on the inside. And I only focused on women and only women with life sentences. And the reason is because this is 2014. Basically, nobody is talking about mass incarceration yet. Or if they are, it's on a very different level than today. And Obama was just starting to talk about letting the low-level drug offenders go. And I was like, they can let all the low-level drug offenders go, and the prisons are still going to be full of people with life sentences. And so a life sentence doesn't necessarily mean life. If you have 25 years to life, it means you serve 25 years and then you're eligible for parole. If you have life without parole, you never get out. So I wanted to focus my lens only on people, only on women, because they're like the left out part of the system, even though Brian just did a beautiful presentation on women and talked about their particular needs. And life sentences, because I just think it's so important. And so as I was following Tracy, like here, this is her 3rd home in 6 months. And this is her going to meet with her state mandated programs. And she talks about the difficulty in finding jobs. And you know, she tried to get a job as a bell ringer for the Salvation Army, and they gave her the job, and then they found out that she had a criminal record, and they took the job away from her, and then she kind of fought to get the job back. I mean, I was just learning all of these issues about reentry and also the kinds of work she had done while she was in prison. And at that, so I've been following at this point, I started out with 4 women, and I've been following them. The 4 women I've been following for almost 10 years now. I added in 3 other women to the project at a slightly later date. But I was also, I mean, Tracy had moved in the first year. She moved about 6 times, and I kept on photographing her in her bedroom. And the other women also were moving a lot. And I kept on taking these bedroom photos. And I was also photographing some of their peers in their bedrooms. And so my husband said to me, you know, I think this might help you enter into the photography world, because this is a really interesting series and it's very narrow. And so that's how I started doing, you know, an intentional bedroom project series. And it's funny, Glenn, because I've photographed 33 women at this point, and you chose, I have to say, like, Tracy and Evelyn were 2 of my original 4. Karen was the 5th woman I added into the project. And I photographed her actually in prison and coming out the prison door. And then Carol was my 3rd of the 4. And I think I don't have the 4th, but it's interesting that you happen to choose the women who I've been following for a really long time. And so when I put together my first book, Life After Life in Prison, about the reentry, I wanted to make sure that I got to all of the different issues in the system. But when I started photographing for the bedroom project, I wanted the women's voices to be more integral to the project than they had been in my first one, which just had the typed captions on it. So I asked them all the same question, which was something like, when you see this photo I took of you, how does it make you feel? And then I asked them to handwrite their statements, which when I exhibit, you see them here on the prints, which I think actually just turned out to be really great, because I know when I exhibit, people actually come and they look at the images, but then they stay to read. And they talk about so many different things, but one of the real feelings is always the joy and freedom, even though this is in a homeless shelter. She's in a shelter, and yet from her statement, she says, let me see here, she goes, when I made parole plans, I thought I was going to have a good reentry situation in the house I paroled to. I realized almost immediately that it wouldn't work out, so I left without anywhere else to go. Parole sent me to a homeless assessment shelter in the South Bronx. The quality of the bedding and the food was a lateral move from prison. But factoring in my freedom, there's no question that it was an improvement. Now I'm in a shelter run by the Women's Prison Association. I feel safe and secure. The room is spare with not much in it, but it's mine. In this room, I find comfort, privacy, safety, and peace of mind. Now, Karen she had a sentence of 25 years to life, and she was denied parole 5 times, meaning she served 35 years. And that's what I was trying to get to, was the incredibly long sentences that people serve and the power of the parole board to deny repeatedly parole to people, even though there's nothing else they could possibly do. It's not that she was in trouble while she was in prison or anything. She was, what you would consider like a model prisoner, and just denied over and over again. So by the time she comes home, she's 69 years old, and she was eligible to come home at 59, and her reentry would have been so much easier. This is Carol, Carol was actually in my project around Judy as well. Carol died last year, but I photographed her for 8 years before her death. And she was another one. She was denied parole 5 times. By the time she came home from prison, she was almost 70 years old. So these are some of the 33 women that I photographed for the bedroom project. And then I have one other project that I'm just going to go through briefly, which is I always wanted to photograph women inside prison, but I couldn't figure out how to get there. But by the time I had been photographing maybe for 6 or 7 years, and I had had some exhibitions and some attention to my work, I felt like I had the credibility to ask to go into prison. And so I started photographing inside prison. I had asked to photograph in the cell, and they told me I would never, ever, ever be allowed to photograph in a cell. And they wanted me to photograph in the conference room. And so I went through a lot of negotiation, and I ultimately was allowed to photograph in their workplaces. And so I think the Department of Corrections thought I was doing a workplace series, but I thought I was doing a series about the humanity of the women behind bars. This woman here actually has a life without parole sentence, meaning she's not eligible for parole. A lot of these women I've actually found representation for. She wrote me, I have really long relationships with all these women at this point. And she wrote me one day in passing and said if she had just taken the plea deal, she would be almost out of prison. And I just, it just gave me pause, and I investigated a little bit, and sure enough, she had been offered a plea deal of 17 years to life. So I found a lawyer for her, and I'm hopeful that she'll have some relief. So they said I wasn't going to photograph in the cell. It happened by just one of those things that, if somebody wants to ask me about it later, I'll tell you, but everything went right for me on that day, and everything went wrong for the prison. And that's how I got in the cell. And I was so nervous when I took it and when I was leaving the prison, but I did get the image. This is Monica. So Monica is also in this issue of ZEKE magazine. So I actually met Monica shortly after I met my client, Judy. And I worked with Monica's attorneys, and we won clemency for her about 3 years ago. And then she got out. I photographed her at her wedding. A lot of the women have actually started to come home, and so they're all joining my bedroom project series, which is amazing. This is Asia. I actually photographed Asia remotely. She lives in Panama, so I used Shutter app and photographed her in Panama. So these are all women inside and out, and sometimes they barely look the same. They just look younger, happier, healthier. So this is my client, Judy, who we did win clemency for. So this is her. She also came home in 2019. And then this is Tracy, who I started off at the very beginning with. And this is her just now out in the world. And she looks so much, she's really of the world now. It's 9 years since I first photographed her. So those are my series.
All right. Well, thank you, Sara. Really beautiful work, important work you're doing. I just want to ask the first question. You started off saying that you hadn't picked up a camera in 30 years, and now you're taking these incredible photographs. What was your photographic education like at that point to get to this point?
I didn't have one, but yeah, I told you my husband is a very accomplished photographer, and so in the beginning I didn't even have a camera. I used his camera, but I would come home every day and he would sit with me. So basically, it was like a crash course in photography, and he would just look at the photos with me and tell me what was good and why it worked and why it didn't. And of course, I've been looking at art forever. And so, but I was very afraid of the flash, for instance. And so I didn't show them today, but my early bedroom project photos were not good. And actually my original work, which you see is in black and white, is because black and white is more forgiving than color. It's not that I took them in black and white, it's I converted them to black and white. So it helped unify those projects and it helped them, get better. I still think I'm a pretty, I don't know if I'm basic exactly, but I use the least amount of equipment possible. I'm always shooting in really teeny spaces. So, but I definitely have a look.
Yeah, you definitely have a style that comes through in all your work, which is so important for any photographer to have that vision that comes through in all their work.
Yeah, thanks.
So does anybody else have a question for Sara before we move on? All right, well, we'll have time at the end for more questions.
I have one, Glenn.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Hi, Sara.
Hi.
Beautiful work. I've
Thank
always really loved this work. And I just had a question about what is the biggest challenge that the women face upon reentry?
Oh, I think it's different for everybody. I mean, the longer you've been in prison, the fewer contacts you have in the outside world. So a lot of women actually live in kind of the formerly incarcerated women. Some of the housing is, by a formerly incarcerated group, things like that. I mean, getting jobs is really, really housing, jobs, money. There's just this incredible joie de vivre, that's incredible. And so I think people just seem to manage everything, no matter what comes their way. I think it's not anything like what has been coming their way for the previous 25 years. So I don't think there's one uniform problem.
Thanks.
All right, well, thank you for that, Sara. Simone, I see your hand is raised. What I'd like to ask is if you wait until the Q&A at the very end, because Chris is timed to come on and I want him to be on while the questions are being asked. So I'm sorry to put you off again, but I'll call on you the first question after our last speaker goes. Okay, our last speaker tonight is Lou Jones. When not traveling, Lou Jones exhibits at schools, museums, galleries, libraries, and institutions around the world, including here in Massachusetts, where he has 2 exhibits going up right now. Throughout his career, Lou Jones has undertaken personal long-term projects such as Japan, tall ships, jazz, pregnancy, and photographing people on 14 death rows in the United States, resulting in 2 books and many exhibitions. More recently, Lou has been documenting all 54 countries in contemporary Africa, trying to change the narrative from stereotypical negative topics of poverty, pestilence, and conflict. So now let me turn this over to Lou Jones.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for including me in this conversation in front of these sage artists that I'm sharing with, and also including my photographs in the incarceration. I am a commercial photographer, as Glenn has mentioned. If you look behind this wall, actually, if you drilled a hole through this wall, there's a studio. My employees have all left for the day, but there's a studio there, and I make my living that way. But I do these long-term projects as Glenn, and a few years ago, I embarked on one in which I photographed. It ended up being 27 men and women on death rows all over the United States. I'm delighted in seeing that many of the people here who have tried to do things with prisoners have talked about the sort of more positive side, people being released, about the humanity of the situation. There's very, very, very little joy on death row, and these projects were to talk about that. So we ended up 27 there. We tried to, with a little bit more dispassion in the beginning, to deal with the issue of who is on death row. So we actually photographed men, women, old, young, black, white, and people who were theoretically claiming their innocence, and people who claimed serial killers, the whole thing. So like I said, there's very little joy on death row. The first thing I want to mention is it is impossible to photograph on death rows in the United States. And people will all laugh. I see there's probably 30 or so people on that were all laughing at me and saying, well, how can you do that? It was a project that we started. I said it would take 2 years. It ended up taking 6 years of literally hard getting. Sara talks about getting into prisons at the end of her project. Everything we did was inside, and convincing not only the inmates, but their lawyers and the Department of Corrections to be able to get into the prisons. We fought very hard to photograph, and were able to actually accomplish that. Every one of the photographs was face to face. And so we were in the jails with them face to face, and without shackles, without glass between us, without any kind of fences between us. Literally, we talked to them, and we talked with them for hours and hours, each one. To date, again, very little joy. To date, I believe almost half have been executed. And this brings up an entirely different issue, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I tried to address the issue from a point of fear, my own fear. What would possess anyone to take another's life? Where could somebody's life have gotten to have think that they had the right or power or need to kill someone? Was where this whole, and it was a point of fear. and I've told people this before, so some of you who have listened to me before, maybe, I tell people that I'm afraid of absolutely everything. So going and taking on this project was a tremendous addressing one of my biggest fears. I often have said it wasn't the reason I did this project, but one of the reasons started was the inception of an argument I had about when I was like 14 years old with my father over the issue of the death penalty. And years later, I was able to incorporate that argument, that time in which I realized my father could actually be wrong. He was in favor of the death penalty, and we had a big argument over it. And anyway, the idea of going in, and we took, like I said, it was impossible. We took in everything. Almost every photograph you see here is lit. You see, we're shooting with large format or medium format, 2.25 Hasselblad. So the individuals were all lit. We took in huge power packs, umbrellas, soft boxes. We took in sound recording equipment so that we could get their stories. And that was one of the few things. Death row inmates basically say no to anyone who wants to interview them. They say absolutely no. They turn everybody down, reporters, TV, whatever, because publicity gets them killed. So they don't want to have anything to do with people like me. And so getting in and bringing all that equipment, and then the stories became so compelling. The stories, to me, for the first time in my life as a photographer, the stories were actually as important as the photographs. So we had to tape record them and find out what was important to them. We never, ever assumed guilt or innocence when we went in. That was one of the rules. If they said they were innocent, we started there. If they said they were guilty, we started there. If they chose not to even talk about their case or why they were there, we didn't press that. We always let them, and that was one of the things that we tried to promise ourselves and promise them, that gave them a reason for letting it, was that we would try to let them tell their story. They are never allowed to tell their story, not to their lawyers, not to the police, not to anyone. Are they ever allowed to relate the story that they believe should be told? So we were trying to let them do this. This is a photograph we took in Texas, and everybody told us, even though we photographed a few people early on in the project, everybody told us, I guess you're lucky how you got in, but you'll never be able to photograph in Texas. So that was sort of like the schoolyard dare. So of course we approached Texas, and we ended up photographing 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8 people over about a 2-year period. This is another fellow in Texas. He's also been executed. If you look at the corner, the bottom right corner, you see a little nib, a little black tip. That's my rep, who I took in, and she did a lot of the interviewing. So that's her microphone. So he's talking to he's talking as I'm photographing, he's talking. So, but you're seeing the jails were absolutely flummoxed when we brought in all of this equipment to light these rooms and things like that. And it, like I said, it took anywhere from probably 4 or 5 months to 2 years to get in to see any given prisoner. And like I said, about half of them have been executed, and it is it has been a I up until just a few years ago, was still having nightmares about going into these prisons. But it really changed not only my life, but it changed my career. A couple of the photographers we've heard today talk about humanizing. I'm not sure that that was everybody tries to say that I was trying to humanize. I'm not really sure that I was. A lot of these people are very bad people. Like I said, serial killers, intentional murderers. The inception of the project was to find out about what would cause someone, and to use the universal language of photography to talk about the issue of what would cause someone to take someone else's life. Again, this is one of the ones in Texas. He wrote back to me. It was very interesting. We did 2 books. We published 2 books of this material. And he wrote, we were able to smuggle in or get through their lawyers or mail in the book, the first book. Once it was published, we were able to get them to everybody that was still alive. It was really an accomplishment to get the books to the actual prisoners, to get the books that they agreed to be in. And he sent me a letter saying that he loved the book. He loved the book. We had done a good job. Now that sounds like I'm patting myself, but it was his words. He said he loved every one of the stories except his. Mm. And I was hurt. I was just destroyed by the fact that he said he loved everybody's story but his. And then I heard that same thing from another prisoner sometime later, and I realized, of course, they're not going to like their story. If we were being in the least bit honest about the situations, they're not going to like. This is a woman. This is one of the 2 women that we talked to. There are very, very, very few women of the full number of people on death row. And we were able to get into C2, and she was also in Texas, and I believe she's still alive, one of the few in Texas that's still alive, etc. And the problem is that we were also addressing another issue, which is very different from a lot of the other people who are doing these projects, these wonderful projects, is that we were addressing a very simple problem. Whereas a lot of the other stories that you've seen, the photographers have addressed very complex issues. Ours was, we knew that the United States, that our America is doing it wrong in using murder to try to solve the issue of murder. And that was what the whole project was about. Still very complex. We learned an incredible amount about how that kind of thing, how racism, as of course a lot of the people have addressed. If you look at the line of the states that execute, that have the highest levels of execution, you see that it's all states that had huge slavery in their histories. Of course, money. One of the people that we photographed, this fellow right here, is the one that walked out after 21 years on death row. He was proven that he could not have committed the crime through DNA, and he's living in California the last time I talked to him. And so he is actually was exonerated, the one that's been exonerated. But anyway, if there are any questions, this is Mumia Abu Jamal. Probably at one point the most famous person on. This was completely luck that we we were chasing someone else that we took 2 years to get in to see another prisoner in Pennsylvania. And he said, well, while you're in here, would you like to photograph another? And I said, of course, this is, of course, and Mumia was, he's written several books, and they've used our color photographs. We brought in black and white color Polaroid, 35 millimeter, 2 1/4. You can't imagine all the equipment that we brought in. And the color photographs are on a couple of his books that he has written. He's not well. He's not on death row anymore. He was able to go back into and get his sentence reduced to life without parole, but he's not very well. He's very, very, very sick in prison right now. These fellows were in the closest we have to death row here in Massachusetts. There is no death penalty in Massachusetts, so these were Connecticut. Connecticut no longer has the death penalty. So these were, but we tried very hard to get into Connecticut's death row, and we photographed three people. This is one of them on the death row in Connecticut. And I went to this man's execution. This was in Montana. So this photograph is just less than 24 hours before he was executed in Montana. And this was the last 3 people asked me, how would I know when it was over? And after I came out of this prison, I just said, that's it. This 6 years, every minute of this 6 years has sucked. Being in prison, photographing people on death rows in prison it's just horrible. I mean, it was just a horrible, horrible experience. I met a lot of incredible people, both prisoners and other people. This is a Native American. He and his brother were on death row. They've also convinced the court system to let them off, and so they're life imprisonment. But this is I think Vern. No, this is Lester. Lester Kills on Top is his native name is Kills on Top, and the two brothers were the last two people I photographed. Any questions? This is his brother.
Yeah, who has questions for Lou? Let's start off with questions for Lou, and then we'll open it up generally. Sure, there must be some.
I do.
Go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it. Yeah, we can hear you.
Well, I have about 1 million questions because I can so relate to so many of the things that you said, Lou, about how difficult it is. And I can imagine, because I know how difficult it felt for me. I was a little curious about the equipment, because when I went into prison, I had to give them a list of every single thing that I was taking. Did you? Like a list, like including the lens and the camera strap and how many batteries. And I didn't take in that much, but didn't it take you all day long to get in with all that?
Yes, we gave them not only a list, we had to have serial numbers, and they would go in and spot check. Our biggest problem, we were bringing power packs, and our biggest problem, believe it or not, was the extension cords. And they really freaked out about the extension cords. And our problem was that we were not only, in those days, was long before I shot another project very much like this in prisons for a couple of years, in which I went, but I used speed lights. But this time these were all electron. We had to plug into the wall, and of course cells don't have sockets. You can't. So we had to run cords all the way down the hall. And then we found out that the tape recorder would get a noise every time we clicked the shutter, because somehow it would be shorted out by the amount of power we were drawing. So we had to do 2 cords. One would go this way, one would go that way. for miles. We carried miles and miles of
Okay.
to be able
I just,
so,
yeah.
it
I
was
think
very,
people need to know, because you see the photos, your photos are so gorgeous. I mean, they're incredible.
thank you.
But I know what it takes, and I know the toll that it takes. Because when I was doing mine, there was a certain point where I just thought I couldn't do it anymore. Like I couldn't gear myself up to go back again. It was just so hard to get in. It was so hard to see how people were treated as I was photographing it. And so I have to say that your work gives me the chills. It's incredible.
Mine was just a little bit, just the opposite almost. Mine was like, it was raining on us when we were leaving Montana. And I said, F this. I never want to go into another jail in my life. This sucks. And, of course, somebody dangled another book in front of me, and I went a couple of years later. I went back and, but it was just horrific, horrific.
I imagine.
You could literally, in Texas, you could feel the fear coming off the walls. The cinder blocks just emanated fear, and it was just, yeah, it was a bad thing. Yeah, sorry to get emotional, people.
Oh, that's good. Something to get emotional about. Simone, you had your hand up earlier. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, let me unmute, and you can see my tidy study here. First of all, I had a question for Sara, but I also wanted to say that I wrote a book with a guy who had a life sentence. I'm in North Carolina, and if you had a life sentence before 1992, before the sentencing laws changed, there's a special parole process. So I'll put that in. I also participated in working on a book called Inside Voices from Death Row. And I'll put that there too. One of the poems there is called Execution Night. And it's what it's like for the people who are on death row when somebody is being executed. So, and my first opportunity to go to talk to somebody in death row, I actually turned it down. It was 20 something years ago, and I wasn't able to handle it. It was somebody who was being executed who wanted somebody to come and document their story. And he was a rapist and a murderer, and somebody else took it on and did a good job with it, but I wasn't yet ready. Time does something for you. The question I had for Sara is that in addition to admiring the work we just saw from death row, it's amazing. And bringing equipment in, bringing a pencil in. I mean, I was working with women on death row in the women's prison here, and you couldn't even give them pencils. But anyway, I wanted to ask you, Sara, I just wrote, you said something about humanizing Judith when you went to deal with her clemency case. And today I actually was just drafting an appeal letter for somebody who's 50 now and has been in since he was a youth offender here in North Carolina, writing to the governor. And the organization that's taken up his case sends a little template for you to write to. And I tried to humanize him, but I was afraid to be informal in my language. And so, should I rewrite it and humanize the letter a little bit, or just keep talking about what he's done for other people and what kind of person he is? And maybe you don't have an answer for me, so I'll mute and let you take that on.
No, I think it's best to get out of if it's a lawyerly brain or a journalist brain, and just get into yourself as a person and really show something personal about what you know about the person and the effect that they've had on you or other people. I do believe in personalizing. I mean, when I was an appellate attorney, most people didn't call their clients by their name when they were arguing cases. They said appellant this, appellant that. And when I came in, I started calling Mr. So-and-so, Ms. So-and-so. I mean, there's just like little language things that you can do that make a huge difference. And I think the more specific you can be, the more novelistic you can be, the better.
So it's okay if I, for instance, put in an anecdote or two or something like that?
Yeah, of course, because that's what makes somebody human, right?
Okay.
It's the little stories. I mean, think about when you go to something where somebody's winning an award, and people always tell little stories about them, right? Or when you go to a funeral, people tell those really personal stories. I think that's what makes somebody come alive.
Okay, that's it, because it's a little nerve-wracking when you're writing something that's deciding whether someone's going to spend the rest of their life in prison or not,
Well,
even
you're
if
not
they're not
making the
on death row.
decision. You're just trying to help
I'm
somebody
just
else make the
trying to
proper
help.
decision.
Okay, I'll put those book titles in the chat and turn it over to someone else.
I would just like to comment that I would encourage everybody to read the captions either in ZEKE magazine or on the personal websites of these photographers, because as Lou said, that the stories were as important as the photographs, and the stories that come out in these captions are really worth reading and add so much to this discussion. Other questions? Just unmute yourself or raise your hand or put something
Hey.
in the chat. Go ahead.
I'm Jack Abrams from outside in Massachusetts. And Mr. Jones, thank you very much for your photographs. And thank you too, Sara. I go by the women's correction facility in Framingham quite a bit. And I'm always blown away what a dump it really is. And just can imagine what they live inside. But on the other side, I attended the murder trial of Daniel LaPlante, who raped a mother and then drowned the two children. And I've spent quite a bit of time listening to the testimony for Ethan Crumley, having gone to the University of Michigan, who murdered the classmates outside, I believe it's Warren, Michigan. My question is, I'm trying to get in my head, which maybe comes across, maybe doesn't in these stories that you folks know far more than I do, about the teenage mind. Daniel LaPlante did it when he was 19 years of age. Ethan Crumley just got sentenced to life without parole. He's 15 when he did the murder. And there's quite a few psychologists that were speaking in Ethan Crumley's case that the cognitive side of us matures at a much slower rate than the impulsive side within our brain. And at age 26, the testimony was you almost turned off the switch and they became a different person. So if any of you who have more knowledge than I could give me insight as, Mr. Jones is trying to understand why people commit murders. In the case of Daniel LaPlante, he was stealing a telephone and it was this next door neighbor. And Ethan Crumley, very, very complex. And then Sara, from a photographic perspective, I do a fair amount of documentary photography as an amateur. And I was interested that you prefer to go with color, but I prefer, for the kind of stories we're telling that you used, the black and white because of the impact. It's not because black and white is forgiving. It's because you don't need the color to tell the story. You look at the eyes, you look at the face, you look at the surroundings. And you might want to comment on that. So I'll turn it over to you, Glenn, and let the people respond as they deem appropriate.
Well,
Hey,
can I answer part of your question about because I think people have a narrative about the women that I photographed that they're all like, they killed their abusers or something, and it's not true. The women that I photographed, some of them killed their children, some killed old ladies. Like there's all different kinds of things. But I think when you think about the carceral system, you have to think about, what led people to what it is that they did, and what is the point of lengthy sentences when we all change throughout our lives. And yes, it's true. When you're 15 or 18, 22, even 24, the brain is not completely, developed yet. But that's not to necessarily excuse the crime, but it's like switching. I think because I was a defense attorney forever, like there was something redeemable about every client I ever had, no matter how horrible it is what they did. Like when you got to know them as a person, there was like that part of them. And they would even say, like, I had a client who killed not a client, one of the women I photographed, she killed an old lady. And she says to me, she wrote something to me like, everyone thinks I'm a good girl. And she goes, and I've worked hard to overcome what it is and to live each day like intentionally and do the best that I can. But the girl who committed that crime also lives within me, and I have to kind of fight against that. Don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of like, I think we have to, if we're really going to change how we feel about the carceral system, then I think we have to look beyond totally what it is that somebody did and understand that there's so many redeeming qualities. And I know, like, I hope you come back in a few weeks when Howard Zare talks about restorative justice. And and, you know, what that looks like how we, you know, I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but.
Excuse me, Sarah, Chris is only on the line for another few minutes. Chris, are you still with us? Chris? Oh, I'm sorry. I think we lost him. I want to hear his response to this, but he must have timed out. I'm sorry.
Hello?
Chris?
Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Chris, I wonder if you have a response to this discussion. You know, part of it was the teenage mind, and just hearing Sara talk about the carceral system. And, you know, it's not that people are necessarily innocent in prison. Of course they're not, but everybody has some redeeming qualities to bring out. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I think it's complex, right? When we talk about the brain science that neuroscientists are talking about these days, which is saying that, you know, that our brains are not fully developed till the age of 25. And a lot of people see that and they say, like, you know, that does that mean this individual just doesn't understand what they're doing? They don't know right from wrong until they're 25, and then a switch comes on. And that's not what it really is. What it is that cognitively is the part of your brain that allows you to think about future ramifications and what this could lead to. Often is what they mean. It is exactly what neuroscientists mean when they say the brain is not developed. So they're saying that when people are making these choices at such young ages, that they are not thinking about their future. And because of the trauma and stuff that you're often enduring in the communities that many of us are raised in, is that you live off a survival brain, you know, and there's more evidence that supports this, like the ACEs studies, the adverse childhood experiences, you know, they have a 10-point test. And, you know, depending on where you test on that, like, you know, because of abuse, verbally, physically, emotionally, sexually, you know, and a multitude of other things, like it leads people into a space to where your brain is just not going to develop like other people's, especially if you're raised in juvenile systems and in systems at a young age. So it's not that people don't necessarily know right from wrong, but they're struggling to know how this best impacts our future. One, because most people that come from our communities don't think of a future. You know, like I said in my talk, I mean, the last thing I thought about was my future. I thought it was given that I would be dead or in prison, you know, that's just where most people ended up. So, you know, it's really when we're able to break down the trauma and work through and process that trauma where we're able to actually heal, right? You know, and that comes from like restorative justice practices, transformative justice, or education, you know, where people also build and develop their, you know, just their confidence and self-esteem to be able to participate in things in a regular society. Because when you don't come from a regular society, it's really hard to participate in one. So, you know, I think it's like taking those mitigating factors into place and then thinking about how that can lead to people ending up causing severe harm in their own communities to their community members and themselves.
Thanks for that, Chris. Deborah Espinoza, I see you have your hand up there.
Yeah, thank you. I was
The
gonna
caller.
ask a question for Chris, but that's okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, Chris, they just cut him off.
Thanks.
Okay, Beth Seidel, unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Beth. I've had the honor of actually, as I'm a writer, and I've been working with the through Empowerment Avenue with Chris and the writers that he's mentoring at Washington Correction Center, and has been a sort of an experience of my life, a really remarkable experience. I was very curious, though, for the photographers. Sara, I had asked this question earlier, but was wondering if the subjects of your photos were interested in seeing the images, if there was any way, how they responded to being photographed and whether they were able to see the images and react to them.
Yeah. I mean, like Lou, it was a big struggle for me to get the books that I had made back into the prison. But everybody volunteered for my project. I mean, I put out the word and I met everybody before I photographed. They loved the photos. I actually was able to have exhibitions in both of the prisons where I took the work, where I took the photos. And in one of the prisons, the photos are now on permanent display. So we actually had like an exhibition, like kind of like on the outside where it's the guest book, and I was able to take in snacks. The women who I had photographed acted as docents. So yeah, they really, really love the work. I mean, every time it's going to be somewhere, I always ask them again for their permission, and they keep on saying to me, stop asking me. I want my work to be out there as much as it can be. They take really a lot of ownership in it. For the bedroom project and the first one, Life After Life in Prison, whenever I had exhibitions, for the first one where I just had 4 women, they would always come with me. There would always be a talk. I would generally be the moderator, and then they would talk about their experiences. A lot of women call it my project. Like, they don't call it Sara Bennett's project. They say my project. And so there's like a collective ownership of the work. I mean, I feel really excited and happy about it. And yeah. And so every time somebody new was coming home, somebody will call me and say, somebody just came home. They want to be part of the bedroom project. It's a lot of word of mouth.
Thank you. It's really special. And I've already looked up how to buy the book. So maybe you can put that in the chat.
Okay.
So we have time for one more question, and Chris is back. And Deborah Espinoza, did you have a question for Chris?
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much. Hey, Chris, I wanted to know if you could share a bit about your reflections as guest editor, reviewing all of the work and the projects that you looked at. Like, what was your sense of the overall, I guess the genre, maybe that's not a good word, but could you just share a bit about your thoughts about the work overall?
Yeah, for sure. First, like, coming into the space, I was just like really, excited and to be a part. It's always nice to be a part of these kind of bigger projects. And, Glenn was like really open to like letting me kind of have a lot of leeway on like how we moved and navigated this space since I am a person that's incarcerated. So that was just really incredible. And being able to bring different voices of other individuals who are incarcerated into the space of doing some of the writing. Obviously the photography was a little harder on our end because they don't just give us iPhones, but, and then seeing the realism of the photographs and, just all the different people's stuff that we went through, it was just really incredible to feel all these different spaces because things were so different and everything brought a different aspect and humanization to the individuals that, were photographed and were involved in all these projects. And just, I think that the more you look at these projects, the more it humanized the people. And, as me and Glenn continued to work together for the months as we put the project together, that was like, I kept telling Glenn, that's my number one thing. Like, I write and I do all this work that I do because I want to humanize people on the inside. Because once we get to a spot to where we've humanized those who are inside, it becomes a lot easier to start to address the solutions and or the problems with solutions. And so it really felt good to be able to do that through photography because it's so much easier sometimes than just telling a story, right? Like, really looking at someone, you're really experiencing them as a being on this planet. It's just kind of like if you meet and have a good conversation with someone, like, you always come away feeling a little bit different than you might have if you didn't have that context. So I think this project offered that really well. And like all the guys here were excited about it. And like, looking at I got the first magazine from the first print, that I went off and just everybody was just so worked up to see all the work and the photography and just, other people who are incarcerated writing in there and stuff like that. So, it really was a blessing.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Chris. And one thing I really appreciate working with Chris is that he really encouraged us to work with incarcerated writers. So all of the writing in the magazine, beyond the photography, is by people who either are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. And I particularly want to draw people's attention to one piece in particular that is just outstanding. It's called Open Eyes Within Hidden Places by April Harris, an incarcerated woman in Chico, California. And she just talks about the day-to-day reality for a prisoner or woman prisoner in California. And you can read that either online or when the print version arrives. So I want to thank everybody who's come here tonight. I particularly want to thank our presenters. And if you want to unmute yourself and just give everybody an applause. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everybody. And remember that part 2 is on November 6th with 4 other photographers and Antoine Davis, who is a formerly incarcerated writer who wrote one of the book reviews. All right, well, thank you, everybody. This is recorded and will be on the SDN YouTube channel shortly.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Chris.
For sure. Thank you.